The fog clung to the hollows of Odd, West Virginia, like a shroud over forgotten graves, where the Whitaker family had rooted themselves deeper than the ancient oaks twisting up from the rocky soil. It was a place where the world outside faded into myth, and the only truths were those whispered in the dim glow of kerosene lamps. Betty Whitaker, with her pale skin stretched tight over fragile bones and eyes that held the vacant stare of someone who'd seen too much too young, had grown up in this shadow. The house, more a sagging heap of weathered planks and rusted tin than a home, creaked under the weight of secrets, its rooms crowded with kin whose faces mirrored each other in unsettling ways, the same crooked smiles, the same murmured grunts that passed for speech. Her brother Ray, older by just a few years but already bent like their father from the hardscrabble life, watched her always, his gaze lingering in the quiet hours when the family gathered around the scarred oak table for meals of whatever the land grudgingly provided. No one spoke of the blood that bound them too closely, of the unions that had tangled their lineage into knots no outsider could unravel. But on that chill autumn evening, as the wind howled through the cracks like a warning, Betty's parents pulled her aside into the back room where the air hung heavy with the scent of damp earth and unspoken sins. "It's time," her mother rasped, her voice a brittle echo of generations past, while her father nodded solemnly, his hands trembling on the worn Bible that held their twisted gospel. Betty felt the room close in, the walls pulsing with the heartbeat of the family curse, knowing in her gut that what they demanded would drag her into the abyss from which there was no return. The hills around Odd, West Virginia, rise sharp and sudden, as though the earth itself tried to shrug off anything that dared settle there. Tucked into one of the deepest folds, where even the crows seem reluctant to linger, sits the Whitaker place, a cluster of sagging buildings half swallowed by kudzu and rust. From a distance it looks abandoned, just another Appalachian ruin claimed by time and poverty, but step closer and the signs of life appear, smoke curling thin from a stovepipe, a dog's low growl, the glint of eyes behind warped window glass. The family has been here since the late 1800s, when great-grandfather Henry Whitaker staked a claim after the timber companies stripped the ridge bare and moved on. He married his first cousin Ada, because the nearest church was 30 miles of mud and mountain, and because, as the family still says, Whitaker blood don't mix with outsiders. That was the beginning. Henry and Ada had 9 children, 7 of whom lived. 4 of those married cousins who carried the same last name, and the pattern repeated, generation after generation, each new union pulling the knot tighter. Property stayed intact, money never left the hollow, and the world beyond the ridge became little more than rumor. By the time Betty was born, the family tree had twisted into something more like a bramble. Brothers married sisters, uncles married nieces, double first cousins married each other until the relationships were impossible to chart without tracing the same names in circles. Speech grew sparse and strange, many of the younger ones communicated in grunts and gestures, their faces marked by the unmistakable signatures of recessive genes run rampant, widely spaced eyes, underdeveloped jaws, skin so thin the blue veins showed through like road maps. Doctors, teachers, even census takers learned to stay away. Deliveries were left at the edge of the dirt track. Mail, if it came at all, was collected by the oldest boy who could still walk to town. Inside the main house, time moved differently. Kerosene lamps never quite banished the shadows, and every corner smelled of wood smoke, mildew, and something metallic that clung to the back of the throat. Portraits of long-dead Whitakers stared down from the walls, their eyes following whoever moved through the cramped rooms. The family ate together at a table scarred by decades of knives, passing bowls of beans and cornbread in near silence, the only conversation the soft clicking of dentures and the occasional muttered blessing that sounded more like a warning. Outsiders who glimpsed them, a rare traveling preacher, a lost hunter, spoke afterward of a feeling heavier than fear, as if the air itself carried the weight of every forbidden choice made beneath that rusted tin roof. This was the only world Betty had ever known, a place where love and blood had long ago fused into something darker, something that waited patiently for her to come of age. Betty was 12 the first time she understood that something was wrong with the way her family touched each other. It was late summer, the kind of thick, insect-hummed heat that made the tin roof pop and the floorboards sweat. She had wandered away from the others to the spring house, seeking a moment of cool darkness, when she heard the low murmur of voices drifting through the laurel thicket behind the barn. Curiosity pulled her closer until she crouched behind a tangle of blackberry vines and peered through the leaves. There was her Aunt Laureen, barely 30 but already toothless and grey at the temples, pressed against the rough siding by Uncle Freddie, who was also her half-brother and, Betty would learn years later, her first cousin once removed. Their mouths moved in the same wet, hungry way Betty had seen only between dogs in the yard. Laureen's hand disappeared beneath Freddie's overalls while his fingers clawed at the neckline of her faded dress, pulling it down until pale flesh spilled out like dough. They didn't speak real words, just the same soft grunting Betty heard at night through the thin walls when the house finally quieted. When it was over they stayed leaning together, breathing hard, Laureen resting her forehead against Freddie's shoulder the way Betty had seen her own mother rest against her father's after chores. There was tenderness in it, a sick kind of tenderness, and that was what lodged like a burr under Betty's skin. Later that same week she watched her older brother Ray stare too long at their cousin sister Eileen while she bent to feed the chickens, his eyes tracking the swing of her hips with a hunger that made Betty's stomach knot. At supper that night Ray's bare foot found Eileen's under the table and stayed there, rubbing slow circles against her ankle while their mother ladled out soup without looking up. No one scolded them. No one even blinked. Night after night Betty lay awake on her cornshuck mattress listening to the creak of bed springs, the muffled moans that rose and fell like wind through the hollow. She began to notice how the family spoke of keeping it close and not letting the blood stray, phrases dropped casually between talk of weather and hog prices. The older women would stroke her hair and tell her she was growing into a fine Whitaker girl, their fingers lingering on her collarbones, measuring, approving. In the flicker of lamplight their faces looked like masks carved from the same soft, pale wood, and Betty understood for the first time that the whispers weren't about ghosts or haints in the woods. They were about what happened inside the house after the lamps were turned low, about the shape love took when it had nowhere else to go. The evening they told her, the first hard frost had already silvered the pumpkin vines and the mountains stood out knife-sharp against a sky the color of tarnished pewter. Betty was 16, thin as a hickory switch, her monthly bleeding now regular enough that the older women nodded to one another behind their hands. She had spent the day splitting kindling, the axe handle slick with her own blood where blisters had burst, and she came into the house expecting nothing more than the usual bowl of pinto beans and a pallet by the stove. Her parents waited in the front room, the one place the family never lingered because the windows let in too much cold. A single coal oil lamp burned on the mantel, throwing long shadows that jerked whenever the chimney coughed smoke. Her father, John, sat in the ladder-back chair that had belonged to his father and his father before him, the Bible shut tight on his knee like a loaded gun. Her mother, Lorraine, stood behind him with her hands knotted in her apron, knuckles white as the frost outside. John didn't look at Betty when he spoke. He stared at the floorboards instead, tracing the grain with eyes the washed-out blue every Whitaker carried. "The Lord seen fit to keep us apart from the world," he began, voice flat as well water. "Seen fit to keep our blood strong and clean. Ain't no room for strangers in what he give us." He opened the Bible but didn't read from it. The verses he needed had been burned into him since cradle days. "Ray's of age now. Strong back, good hands. The land'll pass to him same as it passed to me. And you, Betty, you'll stand beside him. Like the book allows. Like the old ones done." Lorraine's breath hitched, a small animal sound quickly swallowed. She stepped forward and laid something on the table, a length of yellowed lace, once part of her own wedding dress, now cut down to fit a smaller frame. "Come spring, when the redbud blooms," she whispered, "we'll have the ceremony in the barn. Just family. Just us." Her fingers brushed Betty's cheek, cold and trembling. "It ain't cruel, baby. It's keeping." Betty felt the room tilt, the lamp flame stretching tall and thin as if trying to escape the glass. Ray was in the doorway behind her. She hadn't heard him come in. She could smell the sweat on him from chopping wood all day, could feel the heat rolling off his body like stove iron. When she turned, his eyes met hers without shame or surprise, only a dull, expectant hunger, the same look the dogs gave a bitch in season. In that moment the walls of the house pressed inward, the mountains outside sealing shut like a jaw, and Betty understood that the life she had been born into had never been a life at all, only a slow, patient tightening of the noose. The night Betty tried to leave, the moon hung low and bloated, the color of a healing bruise. She had waited until the house settled into its familiar chorus of snores and coughs, until the dogs grew bored with their own barking and curled back into the dirt. She took nothing but the dress on her back, a pair of Ray's cast-off boots 2 sizes too big, and the kitchen knife she'd sharpened on the whetstone for 3 nights running. She slipped out the back door, past the smokehouse where hams cured in the dark like sleeping things, and started down the wagon track that hadn't seen a vehicle since the county quit grading it in '89. The frost cracked under her feet, loud as gunshots to her own ears, but no one stirred. She told herself if she could just reach the ridge before dawn she might flag down a coal truck on the blacktop, might scream until somebody stopped. The thought of strangers, of hands that didn't carry Whitaker blood, made her legs move faster than they ever had hauling water or firewood. She was halfway to the ridge when the lantern appeared, a single point of yellow bobbing between the trees like a will-o'-the-wisp. Then another. And another. They spread out in a half-circle, silent, the way hunters close on a deer they've already wounded. Ray was in the middle, shotgun loose in the crook of his arm, the barrel catching moonlight whenever he shifted. Uncle Freddie flanked him, chewing a wad of something black that stained his lips. Behind them came her father, moving slower but steady, the way a man walks when he knows the mountain itself is on his side. Betty ran anyway. She crashed through laurel thickets that clawed her face and arms, slid down a bank slick with dead leaves, and splashed across the branch where the water ran black and bitter cold. She could hear them behind her now, not shouting, never shouting, just the steady rustle of brush and the occasional low whistle to keep the line tight. When she scrambled up the far bank, Ray was already there waiting, breathing hard through his nose, eyes shining wet in the dark. He didn't raise the gun. He didn't need to. He simply stepped forward and caught her by the hair at the nape of her neck, gentle almost, the way you gentle a spooked mare, and started walking her back down the trail. They kept her in the root cellar for 3 days, wrists tied with baling twine, a feed sack over her head so she couldn't see the sky anymore. Each time the trapdoor creaked open, another pair of boots descended the ladder, bringing a tin cup of water and the same soft murmur, "Ain't nowhere to go, Betty girl. Mountain won't let you. Blood won't let you." By the time they hauled her back into the house, the fight had been starved out of her limbs, leaving only a dull, animal watchfulness behind her eyes. Spring came sudden and mean that year, the redbuds bursting open like fresh wounds against the wet black trunks. On the chosen night the air smelled of turned earth and distant rain, and every Whitaker who could still walk gathered in the old barn that leaned southeast like it was trying to crawl away from what happened inside it. The doors hung crooked on leather hinges, letting in thin blades of moonlight that striped the dirt floor silver. Someone had swept the space clean of hay and mouse nests, leaving nothing but packed clay and the sour ghosts of animals long dead. They had dressed Betty in the yellowed lace her mother saved, the fabric so brittle it crackled when she moved. It hung loose on her bones, the days in the cellar had hollowed her out. Her hair had been combed with water from the spring and braided tight the way the old women did for burying. Ray stood waiting at the far end beneath a wagon wheel nailed to the beam like some crude halo, wearing the same overalls he'd worn to slop hogs that morning, only now with a white shirt gone grey at the collar. His hands kept opening and closing at his sides, the knuckles scabbed from work and something else. Granddaddy Larry, 83 and blind in one eye, the one who still claimed he'd been ordained by a preacher who never existed, stood between them clutching the family Bible. Its cover was soft as cloth from generations of sweat. The congregation sat on upturned buckets and feed sacks, aunts, uncles, cousins who were also siblings, children whose parentage no one spoke aloud. A single kerosene lantern swung from a rafter, painting everything the color of old blood. Larry's voice rasped like a dull saw. He didn't read from the book, he recited the words they all knew by heart, words that had justified every marriage inside these walls for 100 years. When he asked if anyone knew cause why these two should not be joined, the only sound was the wind worrying the tin roof and a baby coughing somewhere in the shadows. Ray took Betty's hand. His palm was hot, calloused, trembling just enough that she felt it travel up her arm like a current. She stared at the dirt between their bare feet and repeated what she'd been told to say, the syllables tasting of rust. Someone had sprinkled dried mountain mint along the aisle. The scent rose sharp and sickly sweet when it was crushed beneath shifting weight. When Larry pronounced them bound, Ray leaned in and kissed her the way he'd kissed her in secret since they were children, mouth open too wide, teeth bumping, breath sour with tobacco and hunger. The family clapped once, a flat, dutiful sound, then began the low humming that passed for celebration here. In the swinging lantern light their faces blurred together, one pale mask repeated over and over, and Betty understood the barn had always been waiting for this night, its beams soaked through with every ceremony that came before, drinking the vows like spilled blood. The first child came too early, blue at the lips and silent. Betty held it only long enough to see the webbing between its tiny toes before Lorraine wrapped the body in a feed sack and carried it out back where the dogs couldn't dig. The bleeding wouldn't stop for days. She lay on a pallet by the stove while the women pressed rags between her legs and murmured that it was the Lord's way of cleansing. The second pregnancy stuck. Betty felt it take root like a briar, thorns hooking into her spine. She woke each morning tasting iron, the room tilting whenever she stood. Ray watched her belly swell with the same possessive pride he showed over a new litter of pigs, his hand always returning to rest there as if measuring his claim. At night the dreams began. She would stand in the barn again, but the lantern had gone out and every face in the circle was her own, older, younger, decayed, newborn, all of them mouthing the same wordless vow. Sometimes the child inside her kicked in perfect time with their lips. She would jerk awake gasping, convinced she could feel extra bones growing beneath her skin, an elbow that wasn't hers pressing outward from her ribs. By the 6th month her body had turned traitor. Her gums bled when she chewed, her joints ached like an old woman's, and a fine down of pale hair sprouted along her jawline. In the cracked mirror above the washstand she caught glimpses of something shifting behind her eyes, a second reflection that lagged half a heartbeat behind. When she pressed her ear to the taut drum of her stomach she heard not one heartbeat but a frantic overlapping chorus, too many rhythms for one child. The older women noticed. They began rubbing her belly with bear grease mixed with herbs they wouldn't name, whispering that the blood remembered and sometimes tried to fold back on itself. One afternoon Aunt Laureen caught Betty clawing at her own arms hard enough to draw blood and pinned her wrists with surprising strength. "Stop fighting it," she hissed, breath rank with rot. "You carry the whole line now. Every mistake, every blessing. It's bigger than you." Some evenings Ray carried her out to the porch because the walls felt too close. The mountains pressed in from every side, black silhouettes against a sky gone bruise-purple. Betty would stare at the tree line and swear she saw shapes moving between the trunks, tall, thin figures with the family gait, watching. When she blinked they were gone, but the feeling stayed, as if the hollow itself had grown eyes and every ancestor who ever lay with kin now stood guard to be sure the pattern held. Inside her something turned over, slow and deliberate, and she knew with the cold certainty of frostbite that whatever grew there was already more Whitaker than human. Mark Leiter arrived in Odd on a Tuesday in early May, driving a rented white Tahoe that looked obscene against the rusted-out trucks and cinderblock porches. He had come for poverty porn at first, another YouTube video about real Appalachia, the kind that paid the rent, but the moment the road narrowed to a single rutted track and the mountains closed behind him like a fist, he felt the shift. The air tasted metallic. Crows followed the car in absolute silence, wings cutting the sky without a sound. He found the Whitakers by accident, following a hand-painted sign that read EGGS $2 nailed to a mailbox leaning so far sideways it touched the ground. The Tahoe crawled up the washed-out drive until the house appeared, a grey husk sagging into itself, surrounded by leaning sheds and the skeletal remains of a satellite dish strangled by morning glories. Dogs erupted from beneath the porch, half-starved hounds with ribs like ladder rungs, but they didn't bark, they only stared, yellow eyes unblinking. Ray met him at the gate, barefoot, overalls crusted with something dark at the cuffs. Behind him stood a cluster of figures on the porch, motionless as posts. Mark raised his camera out of habit and Ray didn't flinch, he simply tilted his head the way a curious animal does when it hears a new noise. The others watched too, faces pale and overlapping in feature the way reflections do in warped glass. One woman, Betty, sat on the top step, hugely pregnant, her hands resting on the swell of her belly with the absent tenderness of someone stroking a wound. Mark asked if he could film them for a documentary about mountain life. No one answered at first. Then Larry, the ancient patriarch, spat a stream of brown juice and rasped, "Long as you pay." Mark pulled 520s from his wallet and the spell cracked, they moved aside to let him pass. Inside, the house smelled of wood smoke, sour milk, and something coppery underneath. He filmed the cracked linoleum, the walls patched with cardboard and calendar pages from 1998, the cluster of people who followed his lens with identical slow blinks. When he stepped back onto the porch, he caught Betty staring directly into the camera, her eyes wide and wet, mouth working around a word she couldn't quite force out. For one heartbeat the mask slipped and Mark saw raw, animal terror. He left at dusk with 2 memory cards full of footage and the feeling that he had brushed against something diseased. That night, alone in a motel off I-77, he watched the raw files on his laptop and felt the hair rise along his arms. In every wide shot the family appeared to breathe in unison. In one clip Betty reached toward the lens as if trying to claw her way through the glass. He uploaded a 30-second teaser titled America's Most Isolated Family before he could talk himself out of it, then lay awake listening to the mountains press against the window like living things. Mark came back 3 weeks later, this time without announcing himself. The video had already crossed 2 million views, comments flooding in with words like cursed and inbred and someone call the police. He told himself he was only checking on them, maybe bringing groceries as thanks, but the truth was uglier, he needed more. The Tahoe crawled up the track at twilight, headlights off so the glare wouldn't announce him too soon. The yard was empty, dogs gone, porch swing creaking in the wind like a hanged man. He left the engine running and stepped out with the camera rolling, instinct more than decision. A single lamp glowed inside the house, throwing deformed shadows across the window glass. He moved quietly around back, boots silent on the soft dirt, and found Betty sitting alone on an overturned bucket beside the smokehouse. She had lost weight everywhere except the belly, her collarbones jutted like snapped wings, and her eyes were ringed black from sleeplessness. When she saw him she didn't startle. She simply raised one finger to cracked lips and motioned him closer. Mark crouched, lens pointed at the ground so the red tally light wouldn't frighten her. Betty leaned forward until her mouth almost touched the microphone hidden in his collar. "They made me marry Ray," she whispered, voice raw as if she'd been screaming into pillows. "He's my brother. Born right after me. Say mama." The words came out flat, rehearsed, as though she'd practiced them alone for years. "I tried to run. They put me in the cellar till I stopped." A tear slid down her cheek but her expression never changed. It was the crying of someone who had used up surprise long ago. Inside the house a floorboard creaked. Ray's silhouette filled the doorway, shotgun loose in one hand. Mark rose slowly, palms open. Ray's gaze flicked from the camera to Betty and back, something unreadable moving behind the pale eyes. "You wasn't invited," he said, soft as falling ash. Betty stood then, one protective hand spread over the hard curve of her stomach. "Let him tell," she said, louder now, the first time Mark had ever heard her voice carry. "Let the world see what you'll done." Ray took a single step forward. The barrel lifted a fraction. From the shadows other shapes detached themselves, Freddie, Lorraine, half a dozen more, closing the distance without hurry. Mark felt the night tighten around him like a garrote. Betty moved between him and the gun, small and trembling but planted firm. "Touch him and I'll scream till the ridge falls down," she said. "I swear on every grave back there." For a long moment no one breathed. Then Ray lowered the shotgun, just enough. The family stood frozen, a pale, many-headed thing waiting for a signal that never came. Mark backed away slowly, camera still rolling, until the darkness swallowed him. Behind him Betty's whisper followed like a curse, "Don't leave me here." The clip Mark uploaded at 3:17 a.m. was only 4 to 7 seconds long, Betty's tear-streaked face filling the frame, her cracked whisper repeating "He's my brother" 3 times before the screen cut to black. He titled it "The Truth They Hid." By sunrise it was everywhere. Local news picked it up first, then the national networks, then the tabloids. Child Services in Raleigh County received 800 calls in 6 hours. Someone traced the property records and found the Whitaker name stitched through a century of deeds and birth certificates that read like a closed loop. Deputies arrived at noon the next day, 4 cruisers and a white social services van crawling up the washed-out track with lights flashing. They expected resistance, maybe gunfire, but the yard was eerily still. Only the dogs barked, chained now to a rusting axle buried in the dirt. Ray stood on the porch in the same overalls, shotgun across his knees like a sleeping child. When the first deputy stepped out, Ray simply laid the gun on the boards and raised both hands, palms empty, eyes fixed somewhere past the tree line. They took the children first. 6 of them, ranging from a toddler with a cleft palate so severe his tongue protruded to a teenage boy who rocked in place and would not meet anyone's gaze. Then the pregnant ones, Betty and 2 cousins barely showing, were led to the van while a social worker wrapped blankets around their shoulders. Betty moved like someone underwater, never looking back at the house until they reached the gate. Then she stopped, turned, and stared straight at Ray. Whatever passed between them lasted less than a second, but the deputy holding her elbow later said it felt like watching 2 animals decide which one would die. Inside, the house gave up its dead. In a back bedroom they found an elderly aunt who had been chained to an iron bedstead for years, skin grown into the metal where restraints had cut. In the attic, showboxes full of Polaroids, generations of Whitakers posed naked on the same faded quilt, faces blurred by time and flash. The deputies worked in silence, radios turned low, the mountains pressing so close it felt as though the hollow itself might swallow them whole. When they tried to take old Larry, he fought for the first time in decades, swinging the family Bible like a club and screaming about Sodom and Gomorrah until a deputy tackled him into the dirt. Lorraine simply sat on the porch steps and rocked, keening a high, tuneless note that made the dogs start howling again. Ray never spoke. They cuffed him, walked him past Betty waiting in the van, and for one heartbeat their eyes locked, his empty, hers bright with something that might have been triumph or might have been grief. Then the doors slammed and the convoy rolled back down the mountain, leaving the house gaping open like a mouth that had finally screamed itself hoarse. They kept Betty in a county home 40 miles away, a low brick building that smelled of bleach and cafeteria gravy. The first week she didn't speak at all. Nurses found her standing at the window for hours, staring west toward mountains she couldn't see, palms pressed flat against the glass as if she could push through it. When the baby came, a boy, undersized, with a heart murmur and eyes the same washed-out blue, they let her hold him only once before whisking him to the NICU. She didn't cry. She only traced the faint webbing between his toes and whispered, "I'm sorry," over and over until a nurse took her away. In the quiet nights that followed, fragments began to surface like bodies rising in a flooded mine. A social worker with gentle hands and a voice like warm milk coaxed them out one by one. Betty told about the great-grandmother who had birthed 14 children by 3 different brothers. About the uncle who kept a locked trunk full of stillborns preserved in mason jars of moonshine. About the family ledger hidden beneath Granddaddy Larry's mattress, its pages dense with names that repeated in tightening spirals until father and son, mother and daughter, brother and sister all collapsed into the same ink blot. She told how every child born with the mark, club foot, extra fingers, the soft skull that never quite closed, was celebrated as proof the blood ran true. How the ones born screaming and perfect were drowned in the branch at birth because they carried the taint of some long-ago outsider who had slipped through the cracks. She spoke in a flat, dreamy monotone, eyes fixed on nothing, as though reading from a script written on the inside of her eyelids. One afternoon a deputy brought her a cardboard box sealed with evidence tape. Inside were the Polaroids from the attic, released now that the case had crawled its way through the courts. Betty sat on the linoleum floor and spread them like tarot cards. Her own face stared up at her from a dozen ages, 5 years old on Ray's lap, 12 naked beside Eileen, 16 swollen with the first dead child. In every image the same yellowed quilt, the same kerosene glow, the same hungry mouths. She touched one photograph where Ray's hand rested possessively on her pregnant belly and suddenly the dam broke. She began to scream, a sound so raw the orderlies came running. When they tried to take the pictures she clawed and bit, shrieking that she had to burn them, had to burn every last one so the mountain couldn't call her back. That night, while the ward slept, Betty stole a nurse's keys, walked barefoot down the fire stairs, and disappeared into the dark beyond the parking lot lights. By morning she was miles away, moving west on foot, drawn by a pull older than reason. They found her 3 days later at the edge of the hollow, sitting on the same overturned bucket where Mark had once filmed her, the ashes of the Polaroids still warm in her lap and her newborn son, taken from the hospital nursery, cradled against her chest, both of them staring toward the house that waited, patient as stone, for the blood to come home.